we're trying to make a lot of money per acre. And so experimenting is also terrifying. The idea that you're going to go into a system that you haven't used before and then still ask it to be, making 30, 40, 50, $60,000 an acre and trying to adjust those expectations is a little bit scary. So I also feel for growers at all scales who are like, well, I'm not gonna mess with that. Although I have encouraging words for why you should just like mess with it.
Welcome to the Moses Organic Farming Podcast. This is Chuck from Moses. We're on to part 2 of 3 of our partnership episodes with the Rodale Institute. Be sure to check out episode 1 on carbon sequestration, and next week we'll cover the Watershed Impact Trial. On today's episode, I talk with farmer Becker of Cattail Organics in Athens, Wisconsin, and Sam Malriat, the director of the Organic Consulting Program at the Rodale Institute. If you're looking for one model of organic no-till vegetable production that will work everywhere, you've come to the wrong place. Instead, Kat and Sam offer a really nuanced and encouraging view of the options at your disposal to meet your soil health goals. You might even hear a defense of the moldboard plow. Let's get to it.
My name is Kat Becker. I own and operate Cattail Organics, which is a 50-acre diversified organic farm in north central Wisconsin. We're right on the Zone 3B, Zone 4A border, so we're quite chilly up here. And on those 50 acres, we have about 20 acres in a hardwood maple forest where we produce maple syrup. We have about 10 acres of kind of wild forest edge of land that had been logged and is kind of going back, as well as a freshwater stream and pond. And then most of my income, like 98% of my income, comes from about 5 acres of vegetable herb flower production with an emphasis on vegetables. And I've been farming in Athens, Wisconsin, originally at another farm, which is just down the road from where I am now, since 2006. I guess I planted a cover crop in 2005 in preparation for my first farming season. And I've been involved with organic agriculture, and I should always have the caveat that I've never not been an organic farmer. So my experience with herbicide and honestly spraying anything is zero. So I'm not very helpful when talking about transitions to organic. And my other farm is about 250 acres with cattle and small grains and other things, but that's not what I do now. But I certainly am happy to engage with some of the questions about scale. I used to grow about 14 acres of vegetables, and now I'm on about 5. A couple other details about the farm, and we'll get into the reduced tillage questions, are that we have quite a bit of covered production. That's one of our strategies for dealing with climate change and also dealing with soil conservation on our farm because of our extremely short growing season. And so that alleviates a lot of the seasonal stress around tillage, but also planting. And I guess just to explore markets a little bit, I have this year, it'll be a 90 box a week, 3-season CSA, runs about 28 weeks, May through Thanksgiving, and sell to schools, restaurants, small retail, grocery, and I do some farmers market. That's kind of new pandemic introduced marketing, but we'll probably stay doing farmers market as a component of the business. So that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Kat. Sam, do you want to introduce yourself and your role at Rodale?
Sure. My name is Sam Malriat. I'm the director of the Organic Consulting Program at the Rodale Institute. The Rodale Institute is a research and education facility in southeastern Pennsylvania in Kutztown. And our focus has been for about 40 or 50 years on organic cropping systems. So we've focused a lot on the comparison of conventional and organic cropping systems with regard to yield. But now we've expanded that into, soil health, measurement of organic matter, not just in commodity grain production systems, but also vegetable systems. And our vegetable systems trial, which is a project that we have going on here, is measuring nutrient density in some vegetable products that come out of both organic and conventional systems. I was a farmer for about 12 years prior to coming on with Rodale in March of 2019. And this consulting service is fairly new for the Institute. It's always been a part of our mission to help farmers transition to organic production, but we never had a real formalized service like this before. So our consulting service started in Pennsylvania, and now we have consultants in Minnesota, Wisconsin, California, and we're hoping to hopefully double the size of that team by the end of the year with the express purpose of just helping farmers either that are conventional and transitioning to organic or existing organic farmers that need some agronomic help. Our day to day is spent on the ground visiting farms or talking to, with farmers on the phone, text, email, whatever they need to get through the transition period and achieve their goals, really. So,
Thanks for being here. The no-till studies that Rodale has been doing, I think probably the most famous ones are the roller crimped rye into soybeans with the Rodale designed roller crimper. And we talked a bit on previous episodes about the farming systems trials where they've been comparing conventional and organic and different kinds of systems. Is the no-till veggie one of the treatments in that as well?
our systems trial originally wasn't separated into the tillage systems, much like the farming systems trial, which only in the past, I think, 8 to 10 years has separated into tillage and no-till replicates. So the systems trial is looking at that as well, but it's only recently that that has started to happen. So we'll be able to get some more information about that, hopefully, in the next couple of years.
Do you want to talk a bit first before we talk about practices and things like that? Do you want to talk about some of the problems with tillage in vegetable production and why someone would want to try to reduce or eliminate tillage in the first place?
Routine tillage, we know, exposes organic matter to oxidation, breaks down soil structure, it can reduce infiltration. It's got a lot of problems. That's routine tillage. As that relates to vegetable systems, it's especially important because if you're not just putting one crop in a field, but you're double cropping or even triple cropping sometimes, you really need some sort of clearing event in between those crops, especially with respect to their growth habit. Some of them are upright, some of them are vining, just to be able to plant the next crop. That's a lot different than the commodity grain production system when those events are a lot more infrequent and not always as necessary. So the problem is with all of this tillage, this routine tillage, typically, when I was working on a vegetable farm, we ran a chisel plow, we ran a disc, we might do the disc twice, and then we would rototill, and then we would lay black plastic. And that's just for one crop. So if you wanted to turn that over within the same year into another crop, we would pull up the plastic, we would probably chisel, disc, rototill, and lay plastic again. And that is a really, really intensive tillage system to be doing 2 or 3 times a year to the same field. And while most of our research has focused on that, the tillage as it relates to that commodity grain system, just because there's so many commodity grain acres in the United States, I think it's really important to focus a little bit more on some of the actual healthy food that's being produced in vegetable systems and how that relates to what we're doing to the soil. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get rid of all tillage. It just means that you need to be doing other things to account for your soil health in general that don't involve disturbing the soil. So it's a pretty undisputable fact at this point that frequent tillage destroys soil structure and microbial communities. But how do we not take that all the way to the other end of the spectrum and make production virtually impossible at this point with the technology that we have? So that's a little bit of our view on it. I think, just to start off, that tillage is a necessary tool, an infrequent tool. Otherwise, just by being organic farmers, we have limited tools to begin with without synthetic herbicides. So why get rid of the one that, that we can rely on from time to time?
I mean, it's like the chemical no-till kind of seems like as an alternative, it's got a limited amount of time, a limited shelf life just because of herbicide resistance and all that too. So it's like they might loop back around to tillage as well. So anyway, Kat, do you want to share a bit about your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think luckily it's good because Sam and I think have like similar outlooks on tillage, which is helpful. From our standpoint, I think in 2016, right before I had my farm transition to my new farm, and I was kind of having a big like farm and life philosophical crisis. One of the big things that I like put out, I kept on talking about with my farm crew as I was mourning leaving my like 6.5% organic matter right down the road that I had spent over a decade building with tillage, but a lot of cover cropping and composted manure. I was saying like that's the work of our lifetime, right? Like, I mean, I think it's hard to deny that, agriculture contributes to climate change, especially in use of tillage, depending on what types of systems you're using. We actually have really limitedly used rototillers. We've never used tractor. We tried to use a tractor rototiller in 2006 or 2007, but we have so many rocks that it's just really a losing battle. So we have a much less refined seedbed system than most vegetable farms, which is a great thing that I bring to the table because I know what you can get away with and still get really good stands of crops. And I think a lot of vegetable farmers have been trained in these really fine seedbed systems. So the idea of a trashy bed and bringing a seeder through is like terrifying. That's like only what I've done. So I'm good with that. But I think there's the question about carbon and climate change. I think water infiltration for us is such a motivating factor. I think we have a really high water table in the spring and in the fall. We have very wet soils. We aren't in like the beautiful southern Wisconsin, stick your arm elbow deep into the prairie soils. And so because of that, we really do struggle with spring moisture in a way that we don't want to be pushing machinery and compacting the soils just to be able to make beds. And so for us, there are a lot of overlapping ways in which tillage causes problems. But yeah, in summary, I think the idea of reducing tillage, especially around erosion, we can't get a cover crop in after 90% of our fall crops here because our falls are so cold. So that's an issue where we are climatically, trying to make sure that we're not bringing machinery in the field when it's wet is a whole nother like layer. Because soil compaction just makes you more dependent on tillage, quite honestly. And then I think there's the general, larger questions about climate. Those are the things that have brought me to experimenting. And it's terrifying. I mean, I shared with Sam, like I'm simultaneously trying to put really high demands on my farm in terms of gross per acre. And like, we can't triple crop in any setting on our farm that's uncovered. We have about 90 to 100 days of frost-free growing. Maybe it's 120 in the warmest year. So we have a very short growing season. And so for us, just being able to not till saves us time and effort, but also we're trying to make a lot of money per acre. And so experimenting is also terrifying. The idea that you're going to go into a system that you haven't used before and then still ask it to be, making 30, 40, 50, $60,000 an acre and trying to adjust those expectations is a little bit scary. So I also feel for growers at all scales who are like, well, I'm not gonna mess with that. Although I have encouraging words for why you should just like mess with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really relatable viewpoint because even me in my more like garden scale thing going on, it's like, I just want to do what I know works from the farms that I've worked on and stuff. Like it when you are thinking about your livelihood as a farmer, taking risks is a difficult sell. So do you want to talk a bit about the things that you have changed and the strategies that you have been trying out?
Sure. So our farm has it's kind of a two-pronged approach to dealing with the questions of like tillage and lowering machinery impact on the farm. And one of the components with that is a lot of covered space. We were really fortunate to get like a lot of EQIP funding and Bayless grant last year. So, and then my husband, who has a different farm business that farms here, came to this farm from another farm with 12 movable Caterpillar tunnels. So, we have more than a half acre, probably 3/4 acre almost under cover now, which is a dramatic difference from the way that I farmed before. And, it's actually a big adjustment for our whole farming system this year to have so much land under cover compared to what we've had in the past, where we just had some caterpillar tunnels and 2 hoop houses. So, but that's part of the approach, not because those systems don't have tillage or we don't broad fork or we don't have a rototiller or any of those things, but because they keep us out of the field. So I think one of the issues with all farmers, especially in the upper Midwest, is that people are pushing the system really early. All of our neighbors are usually in 2 or 3 weeks before us, and that's because their system really requires them to get stuff in the field so that they can harvest for CSA or they can harvest for market. And so we tried to just basically remove, as we built a farming system, how do we remove that pressure? Because we have really wet soils. And if you have wet soils, it even pushes you to till earlier so you can get them to dry out so you can make beds. And so how do we take that link out? And so for us, that meant more covered production. There's lots of critiques about plastic and why that might not be a sustainable system. We can talk about that too, but that's kind of the compromise that we made. On the other side, we have kind of 2 field approaches to reducing tillage. And one of them is just a full acre of the 5.5-ish. I should remeasure our fields now that we squared everything up, but probably 5.5-ish to 6. That's, even where counting the footprints of the tunnels, that is under some sort of open annual production, a full acre in a cover crop for a full season, which is a different thing than us trying to throw in cover crops. It's very difficult where we live to get we can get buckwheat in and oats and peas. I think I shared with Sam that I have a hate relationship with rye, although I'm trying to reinvent that. But, in order to get something like rye into our production system, it really has to be in a system where it's in a full year, because I can't even be planting into that till the end of July, given when rye heads out up here. So there's that system. So that's just hey, straight from the fall of whatever year, mid-season till through that next season. So it's, a full year plus out of production. That's a cover crop. That's a way of reducing tillage on the farm generally. And then there is the experimental system, which is the scariest. We're only in year 2, so I don't have tons of stuff to report, but we looked at the low-hanging fruit system for reducing tillage over a 3-year period of time. So like Sam mentioned, when we do prep in the spring, we usually chisel plow, we disc, we make raised beds because we have standing water in the field for a good portion of the year in a normal year. So we make raised beds and then we plant into them. Unlike Sam, if we double crop in our system, we actually either BCS or surface till those beds again, or we plant directly back into them, because remaking them is a lot of work and our season is so short. So that's kind of what we're at. And so that's kind of our regular system. And then we might double crop that, but to get a cover crop in, or even to incorporate crop residue, that stuff's getting plowed again, disked again, ideally seeded into a cover crop. That's kind of the best case scenario for our fall system. So we tried to look at the different rotations on the farm and tried to choose the easiest one to attack. So what is the easiest system, and what is one that really addresses some of the tensions around planting? So the system that we chose and then implemented a whole thing around it was winter squash. It's a pretty easy crop to grow in we're using landscape fabric. You could lay plastic beds and then put landscape fabric or living aisles or something like that too. But we're going winter squash in landscape fabric, where we have a strip down the middle between the 2 pieces on the raised bed where we plant, and other cucurbits. That into alliums. So year 2 or 1.5 is allium. So our garlic went into some of those beds, and our 4 beds are going into spring onions. And then next year, I should say, we're planning on putting peppers in those beds, but we are in active discussion about if it would be better to put lettuce into them and then go solanaceous again, if we could get a 4th year. That's the big meta question now that we're in year 2. So how long can we make this fit into our rotation? So for us, it's a very landscape fabric intensive system. We are experimenting with hand laying some agricultural, regular plastic you'd lay with a bed maker. We did lay some in the fall that blew off handily in the spring, but we're going to retry that. And the idea is that we either remove tillage completely from those systems. So we're either adding compost or putting some more fertility on, or we use surface tillage with a BCS tractor. So like part of what Sam mentioned, and also we have on our farm, is that, you know, if we're going to reduce tillage, maybe we can just say we're going to go 2 inches deep or 3 inches deep, but we're going to pull out the primary tillage, which disturbs the major soil structure in a different way. So that's kind of like, that's the basic system. It's, you know, cucurbits in landscape fabric, leave the landscape fabric on the aisles, put some landscape fabric on beds, leave some of them open, some surface tillage, alliums, and then we have a living aisle thing that we're going to try out this year. And if it doesn't go well, we're just going to landscape fabric it again. So it's not very like biologic material intensive system. There's not straw. We don't have lots of growing residues. And most of that is because historically in my farm career, in all of my like deep mulching and other crazy things that I've tried systems, that stuff makes dealing with the system really difficult. So we're just trying this very basic system before we start doing anything. And then this year, last year was year 1, this year is year 2. We're restarting at year 1, right? So our winter squash patch will start this. And the idea is that like over time, if we have this basic structure, we can kind of mess with it. And unless it's a disaster, we can go for it. And in the back of my mind, for anyone that's thinking about experimenting with something like this, if I get like late blight, I'm going to moldboard plow that baby in. Like, I'm not like, you know, so like when you think about tillage, I am not committed to destroying my farm. I am not like, tillage is the devil. I'm like, we're going to try to do the best we can. And if this goes badly, we can use the tools. Yeah. I also didn't talk about wireworms. Okay. Like, are wireworms a thing other places? They are, I know, in the Northeast. I don't know if there's probably like no wireworms in the South or something. But like, you know, those pest cycles and tillage, like we didn't talk about that. And for vegetable growers, that is a really important thing to understand, because for us, because we were coming out of, unfortunately, wireworms, which are a nightmare for root vegetables, which like support my whole farm and also kill lettuce. They come up when the soil's wet. So like we live in the wet place, so they're constantly in the surface in the spring, but it's really hard to manage them because cover crop intensive systems up far north, and then anything that's been in permanent pasture is basically like a breeding ground for wireworms. And so like, we didn't talk about like the pest issue with tillage, but that is like, if there's ever another reason to consider like disking and leaving something open for several weeks, that is one of them, because like you will ruin your entire farm. Like what I was going to say about tarping. It's like, if we had tarped the permanent pasture and then planted right into it, I mean, assuming that that wasn't way too wet, I feel like it just would have been wireworms consuming everything. And so there are these other like considerations. You know, you can use nematodes. They're like other options. You know, we're not also doing a ton of land. So last year we did 8 200-foot beds. So it's a little bit less than 1/4 of an acre. Next year we might do a little bit more. This year we are going to look at onion beds that are tilled versus not, or primary tilled versus not, side by side, not, you know, not a replicated design, but good enough. So like, I think it's like, you can start playing with the system. But for us, we did winter squash into alliums because alliums are the thing. Like our neighbors who just made beds, they're way drier than we are, but they just made beds. They made beds because they need to get their onions out of the greenhouse and they got to get them planted next week. We plant our onions in like the middle of May now. We just like totally don't even deal with it. Like it's a total, we don't even like stress. And so having 4 beds where we can just plug in onions for us removes a lot of that one on our farm, that one breaking point where we're forcing beds in. And so I think that's another thing for folks to think about as you set up no-till, is like, where are the places that you hate your farming system or you always feel like, oh gosh, this like pressure, and how can you remove that? Suffice to say, I still like really am like, oh, it's dry enough to disc. We don't need to disc. I'm just going to stay out of the field. But like, I still have that pull like every vegetable farmer has.
Yeah. So it's like the goals are have a sustainable business, enjoy your life, build soil organic matter. And these are some of the ways to get there, and like identifying the specific pressure points of things that are like causing any of those things stress, and then just saying like, how can I change that? So that's a really interesting look into that.
There's so many great points right there that you just, if you can take any of those away and implement them in your operation, I mean, you're already like way ahead of so many other operations, or at least the standard. So first of all, having an entire acre in a cover crop and letting it rest for a year is huge. We get so many calls here about people that want to go straight from conventional or transitional farming to organic no-till. And a lot of conventional farmers, I think right now about maybe between 20 and 30% of conventional farmers in the United States are in continuous no-till. So we have interactions with farmers that have been in continuous no-till for a really long time, and they don't even have tillage equipment anymore. No discs, no plow, nothing. They don't even want to see it on their farm. The challenge is you've eliminated, a really effective tool, right, for organic production once you get rid of tillage equipment. So part of the appeal of having, when you set up your operation from the get-go with an entire acre rested in cover crop, you're allowing that system to build up its soil health, I would say, by leaps and bounds, as opposed to having every single acre in production every year. I got so stressed out in the beginning with farmers calling saying, I just want to be no-till. I want to be organic, but I refuse to till at all, that I surveyed our entire research team. I said, look, we keep getting farmers saying this, and I just want to be sure that, is no-till really the number one thing you can do to improve soil health on your farm? Because it must be, if these farmers are that connected to it, that they really want to do it. And so I typed a really long email and I asked everybody, like, what do you think? And we had some really great answers. Everybody responded. And after distilling all of the information that they came back with and some of the review of the literature that they mentioned that they had done, the top four things that they put up there for maintaining soil health, maintaining and improving soil health over the long term. Number one was the incorporation of compost and manures. Number two was having a crop rotation at all. And number three was cover cropping. So they put all three of those ahead of no-till. And I think that the literature backs that up to a certain extent. I think that we're seeing, especially in some of the research that's coming out more recently, that farms that are generally reduced till, that incorporate some of these practices, all of those concerns about organic matter getting burned up and that microbial communities are just destroyed, we're actually seeing a rebound fairly quickly to previous soil health levels after a tillage event with the existence of those other components. So now we're trying so hard. We've said that organic no-till is the holy grail, and I think there's still a place for that, right? There are people making organic no-till systems, fully no-till systems work, and that's really cool, but they are the exception to the rule. So just reserving this as some sort of tool and incorporating those other practices is really, really important. And I think what Kat said there, she is incorporating every single one of those to a really advanced extent, right? So we have the entire acre in cover crop. We have a detailed crop rotation. There's incorporation of compost and manures. And I think focusing on those things in lieu of going straight organic no-till is really important. And I totally agree with you. If you got a field full of tomatoes with late blight, you got to till it under. You're gonna be screwed for the next however many years if you don't. And keeping those things in mind, I think that's how you really build soil health in a profitable and practical way. So I'm all about it.
I'm going to just tag on, just because we were talking about the cover crop or the tomatoes. When we were looking, like for any vegetable growers that are kind of looking at like the low hanging fruit projects or like one that fits in really well, looking at pests and disease pressure is also really important. So for us, solanaceous crops are like, that's the ticking time bomb. And then there's brassicas. There's a lot of black rot in the upper Midwest. We've been very fortunate. We get, other diseases, but we've been fortunate not to have that. But those are crops where I want tillage. Like I want to have tillage after like especially those big rooted brassica crops like cabbage and broccoli and Brussels sprouts. And then I want to have tillage for solanaceous crops. And so you might be, I shouldn't say this out loud, but like cucurbits in our area, despite our horribly, disgustingly short season, tend to be a little easier than they are even in southern Wisconsin, because like we have squash bugs maybe 1 in 10 years. Don't worry, climate change will change that. So we don't see squash bugs very frequently. And same thing, our cucumber beetle kind of cycle is kind of like a 1 every 3 year. We get hit pretty hard. So for us, cucurbits aren't on the top of that residue incorporation list. However, we did have to pull all that residue out of the field, which is not something I normally do. So that was a whole different kind of project. So that is like a big deal though for vegetable growers in terms of looking at tillage. Like don't try to write off those things. Like if you have recurrent brassica disease, don't think that you're not going to have to till after brassicas. It's just like, don't build a system around that. Build like the easiest system with the easiest crops, or, and I agree with Sam. It's like, how can you do better? Like we're buying a lot of compost. I used to never do that. That was not even on my radar, but our purchase fertility has gone up a lot, but we're also asking a lot out of our acres. So like, I feel like it's hard for me to ask. If you can't say to an acre of land, like be healthy and produce $50,000 of sales, and then we're not going to give you very much back. Like unless you can really get a cover crop in, then you have to do something. Compost for us has been a good alternative.
Yeah, do either of you want to talk a bit more about the adjustments people can make even just with depth of tillage? Like rather than, like moldboard plow, just doing like something shallower, like 4 inches or something like that. Like how does that affect soil structure and soil microorganisms differently? And for Cat, how does that meet some of those other needs you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you about what we actually do with tillage and what I've learned about tillage. And then I feel like Sam probably has more data than I do. So, I mean, first of all, I'm going to now defend the moldboard plow. I mean, we have a little tiny moldboard plow, but we also, when I moved here from down the road, this land was never in conventional row crops, which is like the greatest blessing to soil health on earth. Like we didn't have to overcome that like Roundup 5-year nightmare that every vegetable grower, including myself on my old farm and my neighbors on their farm, have to deal with, where you have like giant slug infestations and like corn stalks that take like 5 years to break down. Like we didn't have to deal with any of that. That is amazing. That said, not that maybe somebody can't, but I was not going to tarp the whole farm as a way to kill permanent pasture that had been there for 30 years. So we did plow. And I don't think I mean, chisel plowing in that circumstance is not a good choice, especially because you're gonna have to chisel plow for the rest of your life, basically, to get it under control. So I do think the moldboard plow has a place. I also have to say that my wonderful neighbor does most of any other plowing that we've done because he's great at it. And he was here kind of training us. And I had been trained on a different farm by a different family. And my neighbor was so anal about not hitting, because we have a lot of clay, not hitting the clay. And so he really trained us to moldboard plow shallow and accurate, which takes a lot more effort, but it totally creates it's a different tool. And so like, just like any other tool, you can use it in different ways. So that I'm defending the moldboard plow, but you don't need to stick that baby all the way in down into your hard pan and flip it over, right? Like you can manage top layers of soil. And that's especially when you're working with vegetable. We haven't had to moldboard for disease, but if you are in a circumstance where you have to, like, being serious about that is good. We do chisel plow, but we actually disc a lot more when we're redoing things. So we don't usually chisel and then chisel again anymore. I used to do that, but really found like it didn't help us that much, especially if we were just trying to get a good enough seed bed for a cover crop. Again, these are tools where you might have worked on a farm and they always do everything the same way. Like you don't have to use tools like that. And then, I mean, I think I already mentioned like the BCS or the rototiller, or if you have a power harrow, and I'm jealous that you won't break it with rocks, like those type of tools. Obviously you have the ability to control depth, and also just buying one or setting up your machine so you can do that on a pretty, like some tillers have like a depth setting. And I think that Earthworks, I think tools even has some like tools for power harrows and BCS tillers. It helps you set that depth now, which is a really nice thing. So, I mean, I think there's also just like, it's being conscious and thinking about tillage in a more complex way, right? And so I think that that's like a baseline. And for us, the big difference between like primary tillage with big moving of the ground versus surface tillage, I think there is a difference. And that's the reason that a lot of farmers like call themselves no-till when they're actually using a rototiller on a pretty regular basis, because they're not using primary tillage. Side note, or maybe Sam can talk about it, but like, all the rage is broad forking, which is great. But broad forking is like subsoiling. It's not like not tillage, especially from a carbon standpoint. And so I like broad forking in my hoop houses. It's great. It's also like running a giant subsoiler through a field. So I think like being kind of conscious about what you're critiquing with tillage is important too. Like, what are you worried about and what are you trying not to do? And compaction is always like those no-till books, like Market Gardener type stuff. That's always focused on what I would say is compaction. And compaction isn't always what you should be. I mean, it's one issue, but it's not the issue. Sam, how about you go?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I'll defend the moldboard plow to an extent too. I mean, so we've been working with, like I said, a lot of commodity grain operations, and especially if you're coming out of like conventional no-till, you have to imagine that maybe it hadn't been managed or you just took it over or something like that. If it's been in conventional no-till for a really long time, where is the highest concentration of weed seeds? It's just sitting at the top. And so if you were to, chisel that up or disc it or do whatever you're going to do to get started in organic production, and it's already full of weeds, you're planting them all. That 60% concentration of weed seeds on the surface of the soil, you've just planted years and years worth of weeds. And so the moldboard plow in a situation like that, where you can bury them, 6 inches or 4 inches, whatever depth you want to go, and then commit to having, largely a no-till rotation or very reduced till rotation over the next 4 or 5 years until you break the thing out again. It's just another tool that you can use. And I think we try to get people, if we ever recommend a moldboard plow, we recommend it rarely, and we try to get people like every 5 years, no less than that. Use it every 5. Use it, but in a situation where you have a diseased crop that you got to plow under, then you use it in year 3, use it in year 4. But I definitely will say it's a tool that can still be used effectively without destroying everything. We gotta have to get out of the idea that tillage is just this one-time destruction, wholesale destruction of everything. It's just not. I mean, and that's not what the data shows. It's not what production farms show. So, yeah, no, I'm with you there on the moldboard plow. I think there's some exciting things that vegetable producers and grain producers alike can explore, and we just don't know enough about them because they're not done that frequently on. Well, there's no model, right? We're always looking for models, and we talk about models quite a bit. And I think the unfortunate answer is that in organic systems, models are state by state, county by county. And that sucks to come to that realization where this whole time I'm thinking, like, who's got the model for no-till organic vegetable production? And like, it's just a horrifying thought to think like, oh, there's not one, there's 150. What we can experiment with, I think, are things like winter kill covers, planting into, high residue. It's going to kill in the winter. You get a nice thick weed mat to go into in the spring, which is kind of what Kat mentioned. And I think that's another really important point too. Like, if you have this continuous issue that could just be maybe slightly rectified by changing your timing, changing your perception of, why am I planting onions right now? Why do I have to get them in around here, like at the end of March, because you want to have them early at the farmer's market? Sure, that's great. But, why not just stick to storage onions? You plant them a couple months later and just don't go out there in the spring when it's horrible and wet. So I think there are things that we can experiment with that'll help everybody advance a little bit without having to have a model for something specific. Winter kill covers are really tough in a lot of parts of the United States because sometimes they kill, sometimes they don't. in a place like where Cat is, like I imagine you getting some kill, but then it's a question of volume and cover and density, right? So it's really exciting. I mean, I was so psyched to talk to Cat because it's really exciting to see the different techniques that people are using. It's just that we need more of them. We need as many of them as we can possibly get our hands on, because it's difficult. It's different everywhere.
Sam, if there's not one model, how are you going to sell that book?
We're still selling the book. It's just one model. It's maybe two models. Yeah. No, we have to have techniques. I think it's more about techniques than it is about models. But we still want there to be a model, but it sucks because we're chasing, you're chasing conventional ags model, which is the one model everywhere, right? So anyway.
It is like, I mean, I have to say, I will echo I gave a presentation on like implementing no-till's strategies. Of course, like before I was doing it, because that's classic Cat Becker. Nobody else is doing it. They wanted a presenter. So we're like, how do we come up with this? And it was totally like a philosophical, like it was this issue, which is like, hey, here's what I'm looking at my farm. But you should hear this. It was like more like, how do you triage this for your own farm? Or how do you think about this for your own system? Because this is so true. Like I have like my close friends and neighbors are literally like 3 miles away and they use a lot of ag plastic. They're really trying to go like figure out how they can mow and manage the space between that. We have like 5 beds of black plastic on our whole farm. We use a lot of landscape fabric, which has its own extremely annoying to disinfect problems. And, they're just, and while they're like almost twice our scale, they're kind of growing a comparable amount of stuff because they're much more extensive and now we're more intensive. And like, we have lessons to learn from each other, but we're not even in a different like geographical area. But our systems, even, as 2 organic growers, we're like in very different production systems. And so I think that's especially in vegetables where we're growing so many types of crops for different markets in different ways. It is, implementing a model. That's a problem with so many books. I think I interviewed this guy who did not get a job on my farm a couple of years ago. And like, he like railed against me for not having 30-inch beds. And I was like, this is done. Like, I'm sorry, you read one book. I'm so sorry. But like, I'm not. Your mansplaining about 30-inch beds is going nowhere with me. I understand the system. It's just like not the system, right? But I think that's the same thing with, just looking at tillage reduction. And maybe that's the book, right, Sam? I'll help write it. But it's the tillage reduction, like strategies in tillage reduction. It's like that horrible SARE. I don't know if you guys have looked at that. Like SARE has that cover crop PDF that's like 300 pages. It'll be like the same thing. Like, here's 100 ways to think about using this across all zones. And I think Sam and I also talked about, when we were on the phone, we were talking about daikon radishes. And he was like, those winter kill? And I was like, oh yeah. Oh, you're in you guys are overwintering root vegetables where you live. Okay. Then I went on to make like a zone 7 joke, but they're actually in zone 7.
We're
which
actually
was
in
classy.
zone 7.
Yeah. Like, what are you guys in zone 7, zone 8? Oh, they're actually in
Can you
zone
even
7.
call it winter?
Yeah, no, it's spring. They have deep,
spring
dark
kill.
spring.
Yeah, well, no, that's exactly the point, right?
So that's a whole big issue of how do you adapt those strategies and make them transferable, right? Because again, I like came home and was like, oh, I talked to this guy from Rodale, which makes me feel famous. Like, Rodale was the holy grail of all organic research when I started farming. Yeah. And then my husband was like, yeah, you tell him roller crimper rye doesn't work up here. I'm like, I'm sure I said exactly that. Roller crimper rye. Like, yeah. I have roller crimper rye envy. I have envy about that. But yeah, I think that's a big takeaway in terms of no-till or reduced till systems is where you are and what that season looks like. And I don't know.
Yeah, so there almost just needs to be some decision tree made where it goes down. Maybe this exists out there somewhere, but it's like it goes through what kind of system you have, what zone you're in, what kind of markets you have, what you're growing, and helps you to decide what trade-offs to make, I guess, in trying to create healthier soil.
I also think, I mean, philosophically speaking, and then in terms of how I've done this on my own farm, especially in my like very privileged situation to get to kind of like remake a farm after I had a lot of experience. So I didn't have to like we don't have a lot of weed pressure. I shouldn't say that out loud, but because I like knew what I could get myself into. And so I was like, I don't want Galansoga or foxtail. Like that is going to ruin my life. So I'm going to just try to not. But I think even putting tillage on the table as an important thing is like a big step. And it does, like, you know, when you sit down and look at your cropping plan, if you can have that as one of your considerations, I think Sam was like, yeah, just having an acre, you know, I knew that that would pay off because I've seen it pay off. But like, you know, being able to say like, these are the goals and what do you have to make? Like, that's the thing. Like we were like, if we are going to pull a whole fifth of the land out, then everything else has to be making more money. And so it changes the equation for the rest of the farm. And I think that that's like another kind of message in terms of thinking about tillage. Like, you know, what are you willing to sacrifice in like experimenting? And is it really a very big sacrifice? Or can you target places that it's not, where you know that it's pretty much like, that's what I did, where it's pretty much going to turn out. Like I'm not putting like small seeded crops into those beds. And I'm, you know, I'm not trying to do anything that's too technically difficult for me. So I think there's also that.
Yeah, I love that. And we always tell farmers that we're working with to build those things into the system from the get-go. If you really don't want an intensive till plastic system, then at the very least start out with that intention, because it's going to be really hard to wean yourself off of that once you've seen your return per acre just based on that system. You know, of course, it's going to be really intensive, and maybe you'll make more money in the beginning, but you're going to suffer in years, 10, 11, and 12 when all that tillage comes back to bite, and you're still pulling up little pieces of plastic out of the ground, 12 years later that you laid in year 3, stuff like that. So I think when you're starting a farm, thinking about that in the beginning is huge. But again, just regionally, I've spoken with farmers that are in Florida that say they can't get a cover crop to take. Like that's a whole different conversation, right? Like if you can't get that, so we're either dealing with, really, really compacted soil, maybe they have really high salt content. These are things we kind of you gotta work in increments. And everybody up here up north, it's like a whole different ball game when you're not even farming in July. You're taking a month off in July because it's too hot. So, but the techniques.
Yeah, I used to farm. I used to work on a couple farms in Florida, and my boss when he was younger would, in April when it got too hot and all the snowbirds went home, would just plant sun hemp and then go on vacations wherever, and then come back in November and and till down the sun hemp and get to work. So yeah, it's kind of a wild, it's just different. So
yeah, I
really enjoyed where this conversation went, because it kind of went away from the technical and more into like, what are you actually trying to do here? What are your goals and how are you going to get there? And that's kind of the most important thing, I think. So
I have I already told Sam this, but this is the thing that I've learned. Like, I'm sure everyone that's like 15 years into their farm career is just like horrified when they find out something that they could have known like 10 years before. And it seems like really obvious. So like I have a lot of, I mean, I have these moments like fairly often where I'm like, oh my God. Mostly around the financial planning. I didn't realize was like really a thing. Could have just like been much more financially comfortable if I had just like planned that. Turns out just budget for it. But the other thing is cover crops, the like big cover crop thing for me that I learned this year. We work with Albert Lee. We've almost always bought seed from Albert Lee. Now they're doing so much organic. I mean, I like love the direction that company went. Nothing makes me happier than ordering stuff from them. But I called in the fall and I was like, hey, I was looking through your catalog way too early, like I do with everything, and ordering things really preemptively early. But I just want to like check in about different things. And I said, I'm reconsidering rye, which usually gives me a heart attack. And I see that you have some varieties that say they're really early. And there's this one here that says like it heads out early, which sounds great. Like, is that real? Because now, like, if I don't have to wait an extra month, if it's going to be almost a month earlier, like I can mow it, or like we can, because we don't rototill, we are not killing rye mechanically. So we need to wait until it's heading out, obviously, to kill it. And so I had this wonderful conversation. So if anyone's in the upper Midwest, or like Albert Lee serves you, like just calling them and talking to them about your baseline challenges, what you're looking for. But we talked about varietals. And so in the past, I think a lot of us, at least me, have gone with like the cheap variety. You go with cheap seed for cover crops. And that's kind of been the philosophy, at least that I've picked up in every presentation that I've ever been to, is like, yeah, buy the VNS, whatever, clover, buy the VNS oats. But if you really are trying to fit a cover crop into a specific notch, or there's a problem you've had, you should be looking at varieties. And I learned so much on that phone call. Like, we're trying icicle peas, which I bet in Pennsylvania just overwinter great. But like up here, they're gonna winter kill. He was like, they're definitely not gonna live. They're not gonna live. He told me like 5 times. I'm like, I don't need them to live, but the idea that they could grow a little longer, like that we could keep them alive a little longer, because like everything I had, peas in this fall, like it's gone by the spring. We talked about residue, but really looking at varieties for cover crops is like, that blew my mind. And it totally is changing the way that we're planting things. The other thing he told me on the phone, which any of you that are annual ryegrass growers, is that the more expensive named annual ryegrass varieties are all annual. And if you buy the VNS, often because of where they're harvested and where they're buying the seed from out west, there will be perennial ryegrass mixed in, which might be why you have had historical frustrations with the annual ryegrass not dying. So there are all of those things that I had like no idea about. I was like, how have I never gotten this information before? And so I really encourage people to like think about cover crop seed, almost like you would think about small grain seed, like you're selecting for different characteristics, but choose varieties that fit the actual cover crop characteristics you want, and then think about, experimenting. Like we buy VNS buckwheat. Buckwheat is my like if you got to throw something in or you want to hold soil, buckwheat is always there for us in the warm season. But I feel like I'm liberated to deal with rye now. And there's a whole bunch of other overwintering options that I feel like, again, I was terrified of. So that's my plug. Call Albert Lee, tell them what is actually your problem.
Yeah. And actually, like a couple episodes ago, Lisa Kissing-Kusek was on. She was interviewed, and her whole job is breeding cover crops. So it's like a whole thing people are working on to make better for farmers. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I guess probably all I would say to close is that farmers are trying a lot of different things that are working out there. And there's a lot we can learn, from each other, just about the techniques, right? If we're not talking about models, then we'll talk about techniques. But we're going to have to break out of this no-till thing. I mean, we really got to start questioning what we're talking about when we say, can no-till be a goal? Yeah, sure. It should be something we work toward. It is. I mean, it's a good way to improve soil health. But when we're talking about something that your life depends on, then you really shouldn't throw anything out the window if you can avoid it. So reduced tillage and incorporating some of those other things is going to be really important, I think, in getting us to that ideal. Yeah, I was super excited to talk to Kat about her operation, because some of those things, I would take back to other farmers and suggest, look into some of these different varieties of cover crops. Think about putting aside an acre for an entire year. Build your system with these things in place so that you don't run into those issues 10 years down the line. So I think we'll get there, but let's, give ourselves a little time.
And
Chuck,
don't beat yourself up if you have to plow.
Don't beat
yourself up enough.
Yeah.
If nothing else from this podcast, I hope people are like, I can till and I'm not a bad person, and tillage is a tool. So that don't feel guilty if you have to go into your hoop house and rototill it, even if you weren't planning on it, so that you don't kill your entire crop. But it is like the pest cycles also can be really intense. And there are reasons to use tillage for that as well, especially since like we don't spray, and I feel so good about that, but I can't do that without tillage. Like there's no way to do both of those things, at least in my current system.
But yeah, it just brings back to mind in the organic standards, it's like the definition of organic production includes the words managing your system to respond to site-specific conditions. So it's like, yeah, like what works for Kat maybe wouldn't work for somebody else, but like tarping would have been a disaster for her, but it might work for somebody else. So it's like, it's by definition site-specific. So it going from the conventional mindset to the organic mindset is such a shift.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciated talking to you and had a lot of fun. So I feel like there should be a Kat and Sam podcast.
I'm going to get Rodale to write a big SARE grant that I'm on, so I don't have to write the grant, but I'll do the research. That's my game plan.
We're going to keep talking after this. Yeah, we got some ideas. We're going to see what we come up with.
I'm in. I just don't want to write any more grants. I'm over it. I'm so over it.
All right, we can handle that. All right.
Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciated that a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks to the staff at the Rodale Institute for putting this together, and to Sam Malriat and Kat Becker for the conversation. And thank you for listening to the Moses Organic Farming Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and to tell a farmer friend about the show. Moses educates farmers in sustainable and organic agriculture. Call the Organic Answer Line to ask a specialist about organic farming and certification at 888-90-MOSES or visit mosesorganic.org/ask. All of our farmer specialists can talk to you about everything organic farming related, including grain, vegetables, fruit, all kinds of livestock, beekeeping, organic certification, food safety, marketing, urban farming, land access, and more. These services are available in English, Hmong, Spanish, Swahili, and Somali. If you have any questions about today's episode or have ideas for future episodes, please contact me at chuck@mosesorganic.org. Our theme song is Summerfields by the Tenements. Thanks again for listening.